There's a question almost everyone has asked themselves at some point while sitting on a plane. What would happen if someone opened that door right now? Most people think the answer is simple. That the plane would instantly depressurize. That everything would fly out. That the aircraft would lose control and plummet from the sky. But that's not what happens. In fact, the most surprising part of this story is that at 10,000 meters, opening an airplane door is much more difficult than most people imagine. And the few real-life cases where something similar has happened are nothing like what you see in the movies. Because the real question isn't what would happen if someone tried. The real question is, could they actually do it? In the next few minutes, you'll understand exactly why an airplane door can't open the way most people think. What conditions have to be met for something like that to happen? And what happens in real-life cases where it has? There's an engineering concept behind this that completely changes your perception. And once you understand it, you'll never look at that door the same way again. A commercial airliner at cruising altitude flies at about 10,000 meters. At that altitude, the outside air is so thin that a human being would lose consciousness in less than a minute if directly exposed to it. The temperature can drop to as low as -50 degrees Celsius. And the atmospheric pressure is a fraction of what we experience on the ground. To allow passengers to breathe normally, the interior of the aircraft is kept pressurized. That is, air is continuously pumped in to maintain a pressure equivalent to that of a city at about 2,000 meters altitude. This creates a huge pressure difference between the inside and outside of the aircraft, and therein lies the key to everything. That pressure difference isn't just a technical detail, it's a real physical force that acts constantly on every inch of the aircraft's structure, and on every door. The doors of a modern commercial airliner are designed with a system engineers call a plug door. They don't open outward like your front door. First, they slide slightly inward, then rotate, and then they can be moved outward. This isn't a design quirk, it's a deliberate engineering solution. Because when the aircraft is pressurized, the pressure difference pushes the door from the inside out with enormous force. In some models, that force is equivalent to the weight of several cars stacked on the door's surface. In other words, the aircraft's own pressure keeps the door locked. To open it, you would first have to overcome that force. And that's physically impossible for a human being. But here's something that almost no one knows about. So, what happens if the door opens when the plane is fully pressurized? Most people think the plane would fall out of the sky. But that's not what happens. Because decompression and a fall are not the same thing, and understanding that difference completely changes the story. If the door were to somehow give way, the pressure difference would cause decompression. The air inside would violently rush out in fractions of a second. There would be a deafening sound, a momentary fog caused by the condensation of the expanding humid air, and a sudden drop in temperature, all in less than 2 seconds. The passengers closest to the opening would be the most affected. Unsecured objects would be flung out. Oxygen masks would automatically drop from the ceiling, and the pilot would receive an immediate alert. But this is where the story gets even more interesting. A decompression doesn't necessarily mean the plane will crash. Pilots are specifically trained for this scenario. The procedure is clear: immediate emergency descent to an altitude where the air is breathable without pressurization, generally below 3,000 meters, and diversion to the nearest airport. This entire descent can be completed in less than 4 minutes. The aircraft remains completely controllable during that time. The loss of a door doesn't affect the flight systems. The engines continue to run, the controls respond. What does change is the time available to act. At 10,000 meters altitude, without supplemental oxygen, a person has between 15 and 20 seconds of useful consciousness. That is, seconds in which they can think clearly and act. Pilots, therefore, memorize the decompression procedures to the point of executing them almost automatically. However, there's something in this story that goes far beyond the procedures. Because something even worse has already happened, and proof of this was a flight that took off from Hawaii in 1988. In 1988, an Aloha Airlines flight operating between the Hawaiian Islands suffered an incident that aeronautical engineers are still studying today. At an altitude of approximately 7,300 meters, an entire section of the aircraft's roof tore off mid-flight. It wasn't a door, it wasn't a window, it was a complete section of the fuselage. The passengers looked up, and where seconds before there had been a ceiling, now there was only sky. The noise was deafening. The wind blasted through the cabin with brutal force. And then the worst happened. A flight attendant standing near the affected area was pulled from the aircraft. She was never found. Several passengers were injured. The scene was so extreme that many thought the plane had no chance of survival. But something unexpected happened. The plane continued flying. The pilots managed to maintain control, initiated an emergency descent, and successfully landed. The cause was corrosion that had accumulated over years at the fuselage seams, accelerated by the constant pressurization and depressurization cycles. And that accident forever changed aircraft inspection protocols worldwide. And this is where everything changes. What that accident proved wasn't that airplanes are fragile. It proved the exact opposite. An airplane that loses an entire section of its ceiling at 7,000 meters can still fly. It can descend in a controlled manner. It can land. Because modern airplanes are designed with a principle called damage tolerance. They aren't designed to be perfect. They are designed to keep functioning even when something fails. The structures have redundancies. The systems have backups. The procedures exist precisely for the scenarios no one wants to happen. The door that worries us so much when we look out the window isn't the airplane's weak point. It's actually one of the most ingeniously protected elements of the entire structure. Today, after decades of studied incidents and updated protocols, opening an airplane door at cruising altitude remains virtually impossible for anyone. The most modern aircraft incorporate additional locking systems that activate automatically when pressurization exceeds a certain threshold. Some models have sensors that alert the crew if they detect any movement in the opening mechanisms. Actual incidents, such as the Asiana crash in 2023, have strengthened regulations on the design of seats near emergency exits and on crew procedures during critical phases of flight. And strangely enough, every accident, every failure, and every incident ultimately becomes a lesson that makes the next flight a little safer. The next time you are sitting by an emergency exit and reading that instruction card, remember that behind every symbol are decades of engineering, thousands of hours of testing, and lessons learned from real incidents. Most people are afraid of that door. But after understanding how an airplane actually works, perhaps the door is precisely the part you should be least worried about. Because it's designed to stay closed even when everything else is trying to open it. And that's one of the reasons why flying remains one of the safest forms of transportation ever created. If the world of aviation has piqued your interest, I've included another video on screen for you to learn more.